Hello, everyone. My name is Victor Monga. I'm serving as chapter president as of today, but after this meeting, I think I'll assume my role as past president. I would like to start by reminding us the goal of our chapter. It's to improve the experience of our members to either consume education, training, hands-on workshops, or networking. That's our goal, to ensure that we are improving that experience for our chapter members. We chapter leaders strongly believe in think outside of the box strategy to serve our chapter members, and that's you. So our today's agenda is we'll cover chapter highlights. I'll cover that. Then I'm going to pass it on to our governor, Jason James. He will execute or carry out annual general meeting. Then we'll pass it to Jennifer from Sexera. She will present a topic very close to my heart, the identity gap. All right, a couple of housekeeping questions. How are we going to get these slides, or how are we going to get the recording? First of all, if you do have any questions, please post it in a Q&A so one of our panelists can answer and everybody can see the answer. If you post something in the chat window, only panelists can see it. So keep that in mind. Going back to the question about how we're going to get the slides and recording, please take out your smartphone, scan that QR code. It's going to take you to our LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube. All of these slides will be posted on LinkedIn. This recording will be posted on our YouTube within 7 days of this event. So make sure you're following our LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube to stay up to date for our events and the content. Now, I would like to thank your team who served as chapter leaders in 2019. Without their team effort, it's almost impossible to maintain a nonprofit community such as our chapter. So as you know, we are volunteers, even chapter leaders. Trust me, we don't get paid. But all of these efforts does make an effect, a positive impact on our chapter members. So let's talk about chapter highlights for 2020. We had a dark web hands-on workshop we conducted at Webster University in January. Then we had a Capture the Flag event in February at Pac Dental. Then in April, we had our CISA training where we conducted 4 weekends for about 35 members. And the best part is all of that was free, 100% free. All of these events that we're hosting in 2020, they all are free to our members so that you can earn those CPEs and continue to maintain those certifications. Now, if you have any suggestions or someone would like to be a speaker with our chapter, I'm going to have a link in this presentation, and also it will be posted on LinkedIn and Twitter. Please make sure you fill that form. Let's talk about ongoing projects. We had CSAT review session, training. We're going to host another CSAT review session. That's going to be free as well. In Q4 2020, we're going to host a CISM training. In November, we are planning to host our flagship event every year that we're planning to host. We started last year, CCPA. Along with those events, we're also having monthly events, topics that we're exploring with different speakers, cloud environment auditing or cloud administration. And once again, if you have a suggestion for any speaker event, or if you or someone you know would like to be a speaker, just go to this URL, speaker.isacaoc.com, fill out the registration form, and our teams will be in touch with you. Now, chapter activities. So we started this program called Monthly Chapter News, and it's a quick 10 to 15 minutes video where you can watch it anytime since it's on YouTube. It gives you information about our chapter, what's going on, what we did in the past month, and what we are planning to do in next month. So it's not a lengthy project discussion or a lot of content. It's a very quick update about your chapter, what's going on. In that way, you can stay up to date. This also gives an opportunity to work with or get some feedback from our chapter members. So if you have any suggestions, feel free to bring it up to us. Then every month we post our president message. That's a little bit of strategic messages, what we are working on for our members. Once again, the whole purpose of these messages and news is so you, our chapter members, can hear from our leaders. And if you have any suggestions that we need to incorporate or consider for our strategy, we are all ears. We're also starting editor's blog on our website that You will hear more about it in upcoming months. If you or someone you know who are a chapter member would like to post a blog on our website, please let us know, contact us. And as I mentioned, all of these efforts are volunteer efforts, so we're always looking for active volunteers. Now, how do you contact us? Simple, contact@isacaoc.com. You can send an email to us and one of our team members will reach out to you. With that, once again, all of these updates we post on social media. That is one effort we are working tirelessly on this year. Please make sure you are subscribed to our LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube.
Fantastic. So again, thanks for joining me this evening. I'm very excited to talk to you about this identity gap that exists in third-party risk management. I imagine most of you are all too familiar with third-party risk management programs and processes and the lengths to which organizations, probably your own, go to properly really assess and manage the risk that doing business with third parties can introduce. Yet, organizations really recently are relying very heavily on third parties to perform a lot of business critical functions and to remain operationally agile, particularly in response to a lot of the interesting things that we've experienced so far this year. So today I'm going to give a little bit of attention to a blind spot that really exists in most third-party risk management programs, and that is the identity gap. But first I'll introduce myself. My name, again, is Jen Kraxner, and I am actually a solutions advisor with SecZeta. I've spent nearly a decade in the identity and access management space, mostly in an advisory and consulting capacity. So I spent many years helping organizations in nearly every industry build and improve their identity programs. So that includes assessing business processes that are related to onboarding and offboarding workers and how they get their access and how that access is managed and governed. I've worked with organizations to improve those processes, implement technologies to support their programs and improve their identity maturity. So I'm intimately familiar with the identity gap that we'll talk about today, and very much about how organizations struggle to close this gap, and particularly how it relates to third-party risk management and third-party vendors. So a little about myself. I live in Colorado. I do a lot of kind of crazy things like race mountain bikes and run long distances through rivers and mountains, which is actually what this picture is of, because I didn't want to put a headshot in here. But while I could talk all day about that, I suppose that's not really what you all are here to listen to. So I will ask you to humor me for just a bit while I talk a little bit about me and my background before identity and access management. So growing up, I like to think I was really good at following rules, and I thought law enforcement was the career that I was headed for. During college and really early in my career, I spent time as an intern with the FBI. I was a special agent with the NSA for a while, and also a counterintelligence agent with the Army. Ultimately, I did this for a while at the beginning of my career. Ultimately, though, my work took me on a kind of wandering trek through all sorts of industries, anywhere from healthcare IT to corporate aviation to I taught college algebra for a while. I even worked in marketing and event planning for a while. I've kind of been all over the place. My dad always told me don't settle. I took that really as a challenge to try everything I could to make sure that I wasn't. It really gave me a lot of fantastic experience and really exposure to all different sorts of industries and processes and things that happen in those industries. I think my dad was really talking about boys, but that's a whole other topic. Anyway, as I mentioned, I started my professional career as an NSA special agent, which was a little different than the FBI job I thought I was destined for, but still an opportunity I was extremely fortunate to get. The training was really great. Obviously, I got to do some really fun things, from interview and interrogation techniques to firearms certification. Obviously, one of the best weeks of it was evasive driving training. Fantastically fun. All really valuable life skills, to say the least. But what I really want to talk today about is a little bit of training that I had in analytical risk management. So that's a big part of training as a special agent. Some of this probably looks familiar to you all. There are 5 steps in analytical risk management, and those really begin with assessing the 3 components of risk as we saw them. So the first component being your assets. So what is valuable to us that we want to protect, whether that's data or people or facilities, right? We had assets that we were looking to protect. The second thing we would look at are threats. So who or what could pose a threat to those assets? A threat being, unauthorized disclosure or damage or destruction or, compromising those assets in some way. And then finally, we would look at the third component being vulnerabilities. So what conditions exist that one of these threats could exploit in order to compromise the assets that we've identified. Right. And so once these 3 components are really defined, they would make up the risk profile that we, we're assessing, and we would do some work with that and identify some cost benefit analysis of the different countermeasures that could be implemented to mitigate that risk. And this was, a process that was followed for a lot of different things within the federal government specifically. That's a very abbreviated and oversimplified description that I just went to, but I wanted to throw it out there so I could talk through one way the federal government applies this process. For that, I need to go back even a little bit further. So as a college student, I landed an internship with the FBI because obviously that was kind of the epitome of law enforcement as I saw it, and that's where I really wanted to work. I was very fortunate to get the opportunity to be an intern there for a summer. Still can't believe that I was able to do it. But I was assigned to the National Security Unit at FBI headquarters for that summer. And one of the projects I got to participate in was a trip to Texas to do a SCIF accreditation. So, what is a SCIF? So I imagine there are at least a few of you on this call that maybe are prior military or have some federal government experience, maybe had a security clearance. And as a result, you guys probably know what a SCIF is. But for those of you that don't, a SCIF actually stands for Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. And it's to protect sensitive compartmented information, or SCI, which is a government classification that really goes beyond even top secret. It's used to identify national security assets and information that is so sensitive that in order to process it or store it or even talk about it requires being in a SCIF. And these SCIFs have to meet very strict requirements. I imagine many of you kind of recognize this concept as being very similar to a clean room in information security realm, which also implements very strict requirements to ensure confidential data like PHI is handled safely. So this is a SCIF. And as an intern, again, I took part in an accreditation for one of these facilities, and it was at an FBI facility. Now, the requirements for a SCIF are outlined in a 57-page document, the cover of which is here. It involves a checklist. When I did this years ago, that was at least 25 pages long. We would check for all sorts of things, from sound attenuation to how the finishes on ceilings and walls, to obviously counterterrorism measures. Everything down to the hinges on doors, right? There was even, I remember, a light that had to be visible within these facilities, that if somebody entered the facility that wasn't cleared to be in there, so they didn't hold the appropriate clearance levels, they would turn this light on so that everybody in the facility knew they needed to kind of shut their mouth and not talk about things that were sensitive. And of course, there was a detailed log of all the people that came and went from that facility, right? The entire process was very impressive, and the lengths to which, the federal government goes to protect SCI is extensive, to say the least. But of course, disclosure of SCI can definitely threaten national security, so the countermeasures employed to mitigate the risk of that should be extensive. Understandably, this sort of effort isn't feasible for all government assets, or corporate assets for that matter. However, I mention this because throughout my more recent career, I've had the I guess you could say privilege of being exposed to the guts of things like SOC 2 audits, right? Third-party risk assessments, other compliance processes that were not dissimilar to what I saw, during this dalliance into SCIF accreditations. I'm sure you guys have seen the security questionnaires and the SIGs and the VSAQs, all of these, extensive checklists and processes that have that goal of vetting whether, in this case, it's not a facility, but we're vetting whether a third-party vendor brings an acceptable level of risk to do business with, right? And that's a big part of third-party risk management. So making sure all of those necessary boxes are checked with respect to standard processes and security measures employed by those third-party organizations, all really to mitigate that risk of third parties compromising an organization's assets. So that, your organization's assets, be that proprietary data or trade secrets or your reputation, right? That's kind of the biggest asset sometimes that organizations have, is just that reputation. So this is all extensive, to say the least.
We have a good question.
Yeah.
So to work on SCIF, does the person have to be naturalized citizen?
There are a lot of considerations when it comes to getting an SCI clearance, and that's definitely one of them. And I'll actually talk a little bit about, background investigations and getting cleared to do that sort of thing. But I'm not honestly sure what the current requirements are, because it's been so long since I did it. But I would imagine yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great question though. So let's go back to SCIFs, right? Let's talk about those for a little bit more, and the kind of the security that these facilities provide for the information that's housed and discussed and processed there. When a SCIF is designed and built according to these UFC requirements, can we assume that that sufficiently addresses any vulnerability and protects those assets? Is this accreditation with the specific wall construction and tempest countermeasures and sound attenuation, is that all enough to properly protect everything that's housed in it and mitigate any risk to those assets? And I imagine most of you are shaking your head. Well, no, it's not, right? What about the people that access that SCIF, right? Just like we were talking about, the people that get access in, how do we address the threat and vulnerability that those people introduce? And obviously there are clearance processes that go into vetting whether somebody should have access in there. And without the proper vetting and risk management of the people that get that access, all of these physical and logical security measures that we're implementing can't fully protect the assets there. A person can walk in, read something, hear something somebody says, walk back out, and then tell the world about it, compromising that data or that information. So that said, my guess is that some of you might also recognize this. And when we talk about gaining access to a SCIF, that really requires a particular clearance level with the federal government. And this that I'm showing here, anybody that's had to fill one of these out or complete one of these is probably grimacing at this moment. So this is a standard form 86 or an SF86. And again, if you've had to do one of these in your lifetime, you don't forget that you did one. It's 127 grueling pages of questions where you get to document everything about your life, from the places you've lived to the schools you attended to jobs and organizations you've been part of. You list ISACA as one of these things, these organizations, and everything else that you participate in, right? And I will mention, even if you haven't filled out one of these forms, the odds are you've probably been listed on one as a reference, because it requires at least 20 or 30 different people being included that can verify all this information that you're providing on this questionnaire. So it's a very extensive process to get this clearance. Well, another thing, the first assignment for most NSA agents, which, as I mentioned, was really my first job, is to the Office of Background Investigations. And And in that office, these forms were how I planned my days. So, not only have I had the pleasure of completing more than one of these for myself in order to get clearances to do jobs that I've done, I've also poured over dozens of these forms completed by NSA applicants seeking those clearances, so the TS/SCI clearance. And as a junior agent, for each SF86, I would spend months traveling about the country, doing criminal records checks, interviewing neighbors, coworkers, trying to line up developed references, which were people that aren't listed on this form, because obviously we're not going to trust everything that a person gives us to, talk to just those people, because that's not where we're going to find the dirt on the people that we're, trying to clear. So we have to develop more people to talk to. And I would compile my report on everything that I gathered over those months. I would send that report off to an adjudications office where they would make a clearance determination. And all of this effort went to assess the suitability of that person for access to classified data, or in other words, the risk that they pose to the resources they'll be given access to, and whether that risk was acceptable. Okay, so these extensive background investigations and other clearance processes certainly don't eliminate risk to national security, right? Which is evidenced by any spy that you've heard about, Albert James, Brian Regan, those folks that have committed espionage against the United States. But these efforts do go a long way to mitigate it, and I assure you those numbers would be much higher if we didn't go to these efforts. But the key takeaway here is that we can't ignore the risk introduced by the people we give access to our assets, right? Resting on the accreditation of the SCIF or the risk that we assign to a third-party vendor organization really aren't sufficient countermeasures for protecting our vulnerable assets, okay? And I'm not suggesting that every third-party vendor we give access to should be vetted as thoroughly as those the government trusts with its national security information, but certainly we should do something to know the people, the individuals, the identities that we're granting access to, right? Something to assess the risk that they pose as an individual. Unfortunately, many organizations don't. So, according to, there was a Poneman Institute study that actually said most organizations don't even know the number of third-party vendor users that have access in their organization, right? Most of them don't. And a third of them only about a third of them could even list the third parties that they're sharing sensitive information with. They might have data at an organizational level. They might know that they do business with company ABC, but they can't tell you the people from that company that have access to their data, okay? And this is that identity gap that we're trying to kind of expose. In reality, the workplace has definitely changed rapidly in recent years. Third-party population has exploded. Non-employees, again, are doing a lot of work and business-critical work that in the past had been performed perhaps by employees who really go through a very different process of vetting, right? And these functions, this work that they're doing is really important to support operational agility. But it exposes a lot of organizations to risk. Again, particularly with all that's happened this year, we've seen a rapid increase in the demand for essential workers like healthcare, logistics, grocery store workers. And most organizations really struggled to quickly onboard this influx of needed workers. And they did that because they had outdated or inflexible systems and processes that they were using to bring them in, or highly manual processes. And even more organizations, for that matter, they'll struggle in the future to manage these entities and these workers and the risk that they've introduced now that they're on board and have access to those organizational resources. Particularly when it comes time to offboard them, right? Too often in the haste to get workers onboarded, ongoing lifecycle management of those people are forgotten. So that, untimely provisioning results, as a result, their account access isn't removed when it needs to be. And that really accounts for a significant portion of audit findings and risk for most organizations, is that those kind of orphaned accounts that live out there. I guarantee you a SCIF would never pass accreditation, and SCI would be at tremendous risk if there wasn't a process for knowing who gets access and vetting who gets access, as well as logging the fact that they were there at a certain time. They came and went from that SCIF at specific times. And not to mention, if sensitive information was leaked. So I spent some time in a media leak office doing media leak investigations, and it was imperative to the investigation to have a very clear picture of who had access to information that ended up being compromised. Because if we don't know who had access to it, there's no way to move forward with an investigation to figure out who did it, right? So, research really shows that third parties, contractors, vendors, sometimes even non-human entities, we think about service accounts and bots and things like that, they compose the area of greatest vulnerability for most organizations. And it doesn't even take a bad actor among those non-employee populations. It really just takes a bad actor with easy access to their privileges. One of the easiest ways to get that access is via credentials that have been orphaned, just like I was talking about, untimely deprovisioning of that access. So the owner of those credentials no longer use them, but the access persists. And because there's no effective process for deprovisioning or deleting those credentials, what are the consequences of that, right? What are the consequences of a breach, right? Of course, nightmare scenario is that dreaded data breach, right? It destroys trust. It, costs a lot. We've all seen the headlines when it comes to a few, large retail organizations or financial institutions, and, talk about consequences, systems being hacked, data being exposed, information compromised, the name of that organization in the headlines, it costs a lot. Lost IP, definitely an uphill battle by the PR department to win back customer trust. And that costs organizations a lot. And of course, while this is the worst case scenario, it's not really the only potential bad outcome. Even an audit that confirms unacceptable risks or risks that you should have managed and controlled, it's a terrible day at the office, right? As I'm sure you guys no doubt are fully aware. So while that kind of breach nightmare lurks at the back of our minds, really the frustrations that we face in managing identity lifecycle for these third-party users and vendors, for contractors, for any third party, that can be just as nightmarish. And I spent a lot of time again talking to different organizations about the processes on how do they manage this lifecycle. How are they onboarding their contractors? How do they know the people that they're giving access to systems? And most organizations do not have a great answer for that. They have some very scattered, disparate processes that they're using, and they don't really align well. And this is really the very reason the identity gap exists and why organizations really struggle to keep track of their non-employee populations. And I keep talking about non-employees, certainly this is a concern in the broader sense, knowing the people, even employees are important to know who's getting access, but we'll get to that in a minute. So I don't, just a few numbers to throw out there. It can take, and I imagine some of you are thinking through, what is the process? What's the process that you went through to be onboarded in different situations? What have you seen if you've engaged a third party to do some work? How did you get them into your systems and get them, access to the things they needed to get that? And it can take, up to 40 hours to onboard a single contractor. And of course, that time is money, so it gets expensive, but it's also error prone because it takes so long and there's so many steps and a lot of back and forth about getting those people in. But also just imagine the frustration for the contractor or the sponsor, the person bringing that person in, waiting to be vetted, waiting, for their access to key systems, not only their frustration, but it delays value being realized from their skill set. So, and that's the whole point of bringing in these third-party vendors and these contractors, is so that you can get them to do some very important work at your organization. So, each step of that onboarding process and lifecycle management for non-employees really is a challenge, from, onboarding to provisioning, tracking, offboarding, removing them in a timely way. So I mentioned employees a minute ago. And we haven't talked a lot about that because truly the employee populations are treated very differently at most organizations. We have HR teams, HR systems, these are really a key asset. The best of them provide very standard defined life cycle processes around employees and their engagement at an organization. So they have reliable data in them. They provide a great single view of the employee, full transparency across the enterprise about who this person is, and they're vetted before they come in, knowing that you want to hire them and want to do have them working for that organization. But HR systems and the HR team don't typically provide that same level of information about non-employees that are furthering the mission of your organization. So in my experience, and also, there's another Ponemon Institute study that said this, most organizations vastly underestimate the number of external third-party entities that they have engaged. And most don't even know they've done it until they're faced with remediating some audit finding, or worse, during an investigation or damage control exercise after a breach. Like, they just didn't know how big the problem was for these third-party entities. So if HR does this so well, if we get back to kind of human resources, right? If HR does this so well, why not place non-employees in that same bucket of processes and systems? Many reasons, there are many reasons the organizations don't do this. The first of which is really that worker misclassification problems that are introduced by doing so. So treating contractors or other non-employees as if they were an employee, for example, requiring them to be in the office at certain times, or dictating how they do their job, or putting them in an HR system. These things all introduce liability when it comes to proving you're treating them not as an employee, but as a contractor, as a non-employee. Not to mention, it's very costly to put these folks into an HR system. And this all has very significant implications around employment law. So I worked with a law firm a few years ago that specialized in employment law, and they were so acutely aware of these issues that they wouldn't even populate the employee ID field that they use in Active Directory as a unique identifier when it came to contractor accounts. They didn't even want, an attribute named something that might imply they were treating them as an employee. Nor would this firm utilize the manager field in any system to identify a contractor's sponsor. So they didn't, as experienced as they were in litigation around worker misclassification and co-employment and things like that, they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole if it meant giving the impression they treated their contractors anything like their employees. And it's a very real concern, and things that definitely come up quite often with organizations that I talk to. So again, as a consultant, I spent a lot of time talking to organizations about these business processes around lifecycle management and identity and access management. And my job really was to advise them on how to improve efficiency and effectiveness of those processes. Sometimes by revamping the process itself, sometimes by introducing technology to alleviate some of the burden. It never failed, though. I always dreaded to have the conversation around how they handled third parties or contractors or this non-employee life cycle. Every other process, employee onboarding, how they provisioned access through their service desk, all of these things were a breeze to figure out. They could tell me the processes around everything. They could tell me about their emergency termination process for employees, how they worked in different ticketing systems to get access, right? But even trying to nail down how an organization would just onboard a contractor and give them access was highly complex and decentralized. I would get 6 different answers from 6 different people at exactly the same organization. Because to onboard a non-employee, information has to be gathered from a lot of different resources, like a lot of different sources. Vendor organizations have to contribute something. Internal sponsors are part of it. The procurement office is part of it. The PMO might be part of it. Individuals themselves, right? The non-employees themselves need to provide some data. And typically this game of telephone would ensue, and, coupled with some lengthy email strings or the inevitable missing information, we really need to know when this person's birthday is or what their email address is. And all of these processes were very non-linear. They made for a very long and windy path from vendor vetting to access provisioning to trying to maintain that data, none of that process, none of that data would ultimately land in a good system of record where we could actually track on the people that we were bringing on board. None of those processes supported a clear trail for compliance audits. Nothing, enabled any kind of risk assessment for the people that were coming on board or informed decision-making on what kind of access was appropriate for those people. All those processes did was get the people in the system so they could get access to do the job that they needed to do. And they weren't efficient at even doing that. What's just as concerning is the lack of any process to properly maintain the data once it was gathered, right? So again, after that rush to get someone onboarded, there's no great motivation for all of those involved parties. Again, a sponsor, a third-party vendor, procurement, PMO, all of those people, there's no, great motivation for them to make updates when something changes on that non-employee. Particularly when status changes that would affect their access. So, a contractor that was engaged for 2 weeks on a project was provisioned access with a 6-month expiration, which would leave 5.5 months of unfettered access that could be exploited by a bad actor who gains access to those credentials. So it really opens up that vulnerability and really increases the risk posed to the organization for that. And again, the data that's all in there about these non-employees, very nonlinear, typically at most organizations, not in one spot, but compliance requirements do not care. And I imagine a lot of you have probably seen those different audits that, come back that say, hey, you've got to get a better handle on your non-employee populations and the access that they have. So, I've spent a lot of time talking about this problem, and the problem may seem very complex, but the solution really doesn't have to be. Half the battle is just recognizing that there is a gap to fill. In the most basic cases, the ones where an organization has to manage a couple dozen contractors, all treated in the same way, we just really need to define processes and proactively execute them. We need to maintain as much reliable data in a source of truth about those non-employees as we do for our employees. Bring employee rigor to non-employee populations and non-employee users. After all, those non-employees really have access to the same assets that your employees do, right? And they have the same ability to compromise those assets. And again, in basic situations, that's really all there is to it. You really just need to define those processes and keep that system of record, right? In more complex environments where there are multiple non-employee types, different hundreds of external third-party entities are being managed. Dozens of different workflows need to be in place to properly manage those different entities. And we need to make sure that our processes and systems to support, those processes, those have to be sustainable, right? They have to support all the nuances, the complex relationships, procurement, third-party vendor, business line, sponsor, all of these unique workflows, and of course the compliance requirements that are really essential when you utilize third-party workers. And another thing is the identity gap that we've talked about today doesn't typically sit on the shoulders of one particular team to solve. And that's why it seems complex sometimes. It's somewhere maybe between IT and HR, GRC team, procurement, and identity team. There are a lot of people that there are a lot of cooks in this kitchen, and this can, create some operational discord and risk at times as well. So what's really needed is a system that brings sufficient collaboration to the processes, enables all of these different teams to participate, enables all of those relationships to be defined and participate. And it also has to provide the same kind of, transparency and identity and lifecycle management to third parties as organizations are now, practicing with their employees. Okay. So let's talk about IT's, part in this. IT is really an information security is there to safeguard data, right? And in so doing, a lot of times, and obviously safeguard the organization. But when they're trying to do this, is, there's sometimes the negative connotation that that's going to slow things down, right? Implementing security is going to inhibit, productivity, right? And IT sometimes gets a bad rep for that. But so the ideal situation is really to have a solution that helps IT and helps risk, helps the GRC team manage that risk, but also helps the third-party vendor or the business line manager. Everybody needs to get on the same page, right? Everybody needs to be able to collaborate. The onboarding process needs to be fast and efficient. Lifecycle management, we've got to be confident in the processes that are in place for lifecycle management. We have to be confident in the data that we're gathering and maintaining about these non-employees. With something like that in place, when a third party, when a third party is being onboarded and access is requested, you can assess the risk and provide the right access immediately. And it all happens together in a very efficient way. The organization doesn't slow down just because you're trying to put these best practices in place to assess risk, but your good systems can really help to speed that up, make it more efficient, help the business to actually do this onboarding in an effective manner, while also making sure we're tracking on risk considerations and making well-informed decisions about the access that these folks are getting. So I have to, with all of that said, I do want to just quickly mention SecZetta, because obviously that's where I'm coming from. So SecZetta actually offers solutions aimed squarely at this gap. Organizations actually use our products to enable efficient business processes around third parties. We support regulatory compliance, and we reduce third-party risk in a very centralized, easy to use, and by the way, no code, configurable solution. We're able to actually support all of these processes that I've talked about today and fill that gap that exists around identities and third-party risk management. So, truly it's all about good, visible, accessible, and reliable data. That's essential when it comes to, really closing this identity gap. Maintaining and using this data to make informed decisions leads to good access management, risk management, access governance, right? We need an effective and an efficient way to really collect and track this data, and we need to maintain it in a centralized, auditable repository. And we need to know that we need this data, right? We need to understand that this gap exists, and it's not enough to just look at the organization and determine risk at that level. When there's no centralized repository for third-party identities and their life cycle data, compliance audits are impossible, or at least highly manual and time-consuming and costly. Not to mention error-prone. Data's missing everywhere, and who wants that? I know that that none of you do, right? That's a difficult process, even when you have the data in front of you. So we certainly want to enable, making that process easier. So the goal really is know the risk you're trying to manage, the assets, the threats, the vulnerabilities. Don't get caught focused on the risk of a third-party organization without considering the third-party identity risk that's introduced by the people and the things that come from those third parties, because they're really what pose a threat to your assets. It's not the organization as a whole. So you need to know who they are. You need to proactively maintain them, right? Otherwise, the resulting identity gap really introduces glaring vulnerability, all kind of ripe for exploitation, right? And again, the problem may be complex, but the solution really doesn't have to be. There are great solutions and processes to put in place that close this gap very quickly as well. So that is the identity gap in third-party risk management. I don't know if there have been other questions. I haven't been watching the Q&A, but certainly happy to talk about more things. If you're not comfortable here asking them or throwing them out, also would be thrilled to connect. This is my email, LinkedIn, things like that. Happy to connect with you all.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And no, we don't see any pending questions, but again, audience, please feel free to ask any questions right now, or as Jennifer suggested, you can reach out to her via an email, connect with her over LinkedIn.